1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi warriors, welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host Ingrid. Today's episode is a little bit different. That's because today we get to hear from the chairman for Mankind Initiative in the United Kingdom. Mankind Initiative is a large charity focusing on the domestic abuse of men. Mark Brooks shares statistics and insight into this topic and explains what Mankind Initiative has and continues to do as an advocate. Hi, everyone. Today I have Mark Brooks, the chairman of Mankind Initiative in the UK. So welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining me today.
Hello, Ingrid, and welcome everybody else as well.
Okay. Well, I know you have quite a bit of helpful information for us, so I'm going to go ahead and let you take the reins and go from here.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. And just to give an overview, if you like, about what Mankind Initiative is in the UK, some statistics about men who are victims of domestic abuse, some of the issues they face, and then talk about some of the kind of policy challenges as well. So, and obviously they will apply not just in the United Kingdom, but also across the world as well. And I'm sure there's no differences anywhere else. In terms of the charity, so we've been running since 2001, so over 20 years now, and we're based primarily in Somerset. So those of you know the UK or not, that's in the southwest of the UK. And it's in a mid-sized town, I'd say about 80,000 people, so not a big area. But we operate across the UK. And for my international colleagues, UK is pretty squashed. There's 70 million of us squashed into an area that often is no bigger than some of the big states in America or elsewhere. So we're pretty squashed in. Anyway, I'm actually from London. If you know your kind of English or British accents, even though Somerset is about 150 miles away from me, and because I'm the chair, I have a different role. My accent is like completely different to anyone who lives in Somerset. So again, in the UK. Not only are we all squashed in, but also the accents completely change within 20 miles of each other. So sorry, this is a bit of a geography language lesson about the UK. Anyway, I digress. So going back to what the charity does. So we were set up over 20 years ago to support male victims of domestic abuse. We were actually set up by a group of women and men who had been affected by domestic abuse. So either the men had been victims themselves or that the women had brothers or sons who had been victims. So they set about setting up the charity initially with a helpline. And what we've developed over the last 20 years, but more so in the last 5 years, is a broad range of services and support for men. But also we've taken what I would call an enabling role, which I'll talk about now, if I may. So there's 3 things we do. We provide a direct support to male victims in the UK. So we have a national helpline. So any man anywhere can call us. In addition, we have a very popular website. We have 200,000 visitors a year. And also we have a directory of services which are available for men across the UK. And depending where you are in the world will depend how services are provided. So in the UK, and I think this is broadly different to most, if not all, other areas of the world, bar Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, in that we have local councils which are effectively regional government, states, city government, depending where you are in the world. And under UK law, they have to provide a service, a domestic abuse service for their citizens. And that domestic abuse service has to not only include, obviously, women, but also men too. So that means that in every part of the United Kingdom, whether in England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, there is a local domestic abuse service that will support men in their community. They will all support women as well, but it's not competition between us. So, if you're a victim of domestic abuse, your gender or your race, sexuality, is irrelevant. You're a victim of domestic abuse. So what we do is that if men call us, we will signpost them and give them some information, and then tell them where their local service is. The second role is that I mentioned this enabling role. And what we're trying to do, and have been for the last 20 years, is to try and make sure that those services that I mentioned, that they're high quality and there's more of them, and also to make sure that the police, the health service, from doctors through to hospitals, accident and emergency or emergency departments, recognise and support male victims, as well as other state agencies like the courts, the justice, prosecution, and also housing and social welfare and social care in the broadest sense, so that they all recognise male victims and also recognise that their children will be victims as well. I'll come on to that in a moment as well. And then the third area is that we give male victims a voice. So we lobby government and regional governments and city governments. We sit on a number of panels and task force and expert panels, and also to make sure that male victims are represented. But also, obviously, we do a lot with the media and also on social media and all sorts of other things. And of course, wonderful podcasts like this, for example, is all part of spreading the message. If I'll just meander on to the kind of political landscape. So in the UK, we have specific laws around domestic abuse that sit on top of general laws. So if a partner or a family member, an adult family member, but our main focus is on partners or ex-partners, is obviously abusive, physically abusive, for example, then obviously there's normal laws about violence against the person. So obviously they're in play in terms of harassment and stalking and issues around forced marriage and honour-based abuse as well. But also in the UK, we have something that's probably quite unique, something called the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. And that went through the House of Parliament, Westminster government, I suppose, equivalent of any other parliament or congress, for example. That went through 2 years ago. And what that meant was that there was an official legal definition of what domestic abuse is in the UK. So it covers psychological and emotional abuse, physical violence, financial abuse, which is really important to recognise, sexual abuse, which obviously does happen in a domestic abuse setting, and also something called coercive or controlling behaviour, which is basically where one person has full control of the other. They have to be a family member or somebody they're in a relationship with, and also whether they are coercing them, i.e. harming them, threatening to punish them, cutting them off from friends and family. So that's all codified in legislation now. And that's really helped everybody in the UK, as victims, survivors, service providers and the public, really get to understand domestic abuse. But also the important thing is all of that applies equally to male victims as well as female victims. The challenge, of course, is whether it's applied equally to men as well as women, but in theory, it applies to it all, everyone. And to be honest, it's quite a foundational issue, because there's always a debate about whether Britain and UK has a constitution, but we haven't got a written one, but we kind of have since 1215. Actually, it's how old this place is. And the Magna Carta, which obviously founding principles of so many democracies around the world, and therefore every law in theory since then has applied to everybody equally. So that means that it gives organisations like ours quite a lot of leverage when we think that male victims are not being treated in the way they should be because they're men, and that also applies to their children. So that gives you a kind of overview of the charity and the landscape. And I can, Ingrid, if you want me to, I can just keep on talking if that's okay.
I would love it. I think you're doing a wonderful job. This is very fascinating.
So in the UK, I'll go through some statistics and some of some of the barriers that male victims face in the UK. And as I said, those barriers will be everywhere. And there'll be slightly cultural tweaks depending where either your kind of cultural background, but also obviously where you live in the world. But in terms of the stats in the UK, and these are all official government stats. So these aren't ours. These are all independent government figures, because there's an independent statistics body called the Office for National Statistics in the UK. And so they churn out statistics all the time, but they're independent of the government. So the government can't tell them you need to manipulate the figures. Which is obviously really useful. What those figures show is that 1 in 6 to 7 men over 16 will be a victim of domestic abuse at some time in their life in the UK. And that's obviously, that equates to about 3 to 4 million men in the UK, because our population is 70 million in total. We take out children, it's probably about 20 to 25 million men, if you like, over 16. What also the figures show is that around 700,000 men will be a victim of domestic abuse during each year. About 200 of those will be from other adult family members. So it could be brothers, it could be mothers, it could be sisters, dads, whatever, or sons and daughters, for example, but they have to be adults. The other 500,000 will be from partners or ex-partners. And about 90% of those, around 90 to 95, depends, there's not been enough research on this, but say about 90% of those male victims of partner abuse will be from a woman, and the other 10% will be from other men, i.e. they're in same-sex relationships. It's around that figure, ballpark, but it's around a ratio of 9 to 1. Obviously, there's a huge amount of that domestic abuse going on. There's other issues around revenge porn, for example. So 1 in 4 victims of revenge porn in the UK are men. About 1 in 5 victims of forced marriage are men. That obviously, given the diversity populations nowadays, there's also honour-based abuse that men will be a victim of, and that counts as domestic abuse. And the thing is that nearly all of the victims who call our helpline, we get about 2,500 calls a year, nearly all of them will be going through psychological abuse and this kind of, what I mentioned, coercive and controlling behaviour. About 2/3 will be physically violent. And because the thing is with domestic abuse, it's a cocktail of abuse. It's very rare that a victim, whether a female or a male, will be a victim of just one type of abuse. They're often, they're nearly all victims of a whole range of different abuses which are mixed in together. I mean, another figure I saw recently was that about 1 in 6 men, as well as 1 in 6 women, will be victims of financial abuse from a partner, running up debts, for example, continually breaching court orders, especially around child custody. You get all sorts of terrible stories where men and women will be, denied access to money, and all of that terrible type of economic abuse, and that's the official title. So I think from my perspective, I think the UK, and it may be just because I've not seen it, but the UK is pretty advanced when it comes to not only understanding what domestic abuse is, but also codifying it in law. That means that anyone in the UK has a core foundation of what the law is, and then it applies to all. Some of the things that we find on from our helpline is that, interestingly, that about 2/3 of the men who call our helpline would not call our helpline if it was not anonymous. So when they call our helpline, we don't take people's names, we don't take people's addresses or details, we don't even ask. A bit like lots of anti-suicide, suicide prevention helplines and others. So it operates in that way. But men wouldn't call it. 2/3 wouldn't call if it wasn't anonymous. And then another 2/3, there'll be some crossover. We're the first people they call. So that's really interesting about that. They want to call an anonymous helpline first, often to find out whether they are actually a victim of domestic abuse. So they will want to talk about what's happening, and they'll be like, well, is that domestic abuse, etc. And they want to test the waters, validate what's going on, check. So we get lots of calls that way. We also get about 1 in 5 calls are from women. So we get lots of calls from mothers, mums, sisters, female work friends, work colleagues, friends. We get obviously calls from brothers and dads, etc. as well. I mean, there was one call I remember my colleagues telling me where there was the grandmother, the mother, and the sister on the call at the same time in one room, and they were calling because they were worried, obviously, about their son, grandson, and stroke son, and they were worried about what was going on in their life, in his life. And they were calling us because he wouldn't get help and he wouldn't call anyone or talk to anyone. So they wanted to check it out. And we obviously encourage that. So that's kind of interesting. The last point on that, even though 1 in 3 victims of domestic abuse in the UK are male, and that has been a national figure that has been consistent for the last 15 to 20 years. And again, measured by this independent Office for National Statistics. So 1 in 3 victims, but very few actually are being supported by those services that I mentioned right at the start. So only about 1 in 25 or 1 in 20 to 25 victims of domestic abuse who are being supported by these services are actually male. That isn't necessarily a problem with the services. It's just that men aren't necessarily being signposted or finding them or aware that they exist. So you've got that. So that kind of sets the scene. The 2 or 3 main barriers to men, which are, I would say, enhanced for men, because the key thing is that 90% of what a man goes through is exactly the same as a woman. So there will be nuances because of gender. So there will be some nuances that particularly affect women, generally speaking, particularly affect men as well. One is around masculinity. So wherever you sit on the fence with regard to like nature versus nurture, and we could do 100 podcasts and we still wouldn't get to the bottom of that, or not get agreement. But wherever you sit on that, men often are represented, or society brings them up to be strong and stoical, independent, have a lot of self-control, be quite individual, self-reliant, for example. And some of that, many argue whether that's born into men as soon as they're born as part of their DNA, or as I said, it's part of socialization. Parking that debate. But so that what that means then for men is that they end up not really realizing and recognizing that there are victims of domestic abuse in the first place. So for many men, they get that they get the abuse, they understand it, they understand that it's wrong, but they don't actually then put two and two together and think that's domestic abuse. It's quite a technical term, becoming more and more common, but it's not, especially for men who in their middle age and others, because it's not a term that they grew up with. It's something they've had to learn as a term in society. But also for men, they feel this really, how that plays out is that they feel this really enhanced sense of shame and embarrassment, for example, and that inhibits how they react and also how they try and get help. The flip side of that is also around another barrier around societal belief systems. So society still has a view that the only victims of domestic abuse are heterosexual women at the hands of heterosexual men. And the reason I use the word heterosexual is because I really do feel that women in same-sex relationships who are victims just don't get any airtime at all anywhere. So they're completely marginalised by the kind of this societal and political narrative, if I be so bold. And what that means often is that society, friends, family, work colleagues and others, including those in public services, doctors, police, etc., aren't always as equipped or attuned to thinking whether a man who's hiding bruises, making excuses, hasn't been seen for ages, is withdrawn and depressed, is actually could be a victim of domestic abuse. I haven't seen my son for a year, he's got a new girlfriend, it's just normal. Well, would you think that if you reversed the genders and you hadn't seen the daughter or sister for a year and she's got a new man, would you think, oh, well, that's all right, that isn't a problem? So there's issues like that, and what I call a lack of personal and professional curiosity about what is actually going on in that relationship, and that then can obviously inhibit or be a concern because people aren't asking those questions, what's going on at home, if they think there's a problem. Flip side of that is also perpetrators actually use that narrative as well. So they will demonize a man in their relationship. What sort of man are you? You need to man up. Why you let me beat you up? If you're a real man, you'd fight back. If I call the police, they're not going to believe you, they're only going to believe me. So perpetrators actually use that kind of societal narrative actually against men if they're being abusive to men. The last area is around lack of public awareness of services and support for men. The government runs massive campaigns here in the UK supporting female victims of domestic abuse, which of course is all fine, but point blank refuse, even though they promised to do equivalent campaigns for men, just point blank refuse. And also the political narrative in the UK at a national level with big voices in the domestic abuse sector is domestic abuse is a gendered crime. It's all about patriarchy and a female position in the world, which, I'm not going to get an argument about whether about women's place in the world because that's my area of expertise. But domestic abuse is not a gendered crime. It's a crime, and it can affect people of different genders in different ways. But it's not a gendered crime. It's not a crime against a gender. It's a crime against an individual. And those people that say that it's a gendered crime do so because they have an ideological position, and also they're not inclusive. They're not. They don't have an equality-based lens Basically, it's a very old-fashioned view, which is not fit for this decade, especially, a lot about this decade and hopefully subsequent decades as well, has been about diversity and inclusion on all sorts of different matters. And therefore, domestic abuse should not sit outside that. It should sit within it. But there's too many organisations and big voices that want to make sure that domestic abuse is not seen in an inclusive, modern lens. They're very old-fashioned and exclusive in their view, very one-dimensional view of the world, which is just not in keeping with reality. So I hope that helps as a starter for 10, as we say, in a programme in the UK called University Challenge. And as it starts, the quizmaster says a starter for 10. So that's my starter for 10.
That's so helpful. I think that's a lot of really good information. I have a question as far as movements are concerned, do you think, I don't know if the Me Too movement was as large over in the UK as it was here in the US, but do you think that movement in itself harmed recognizing men, or actually even made it worse because women could then use that in their corner and perhaps falsify information in their relationships to implicate men who are actually the true victim in that situation?
It's hard. I suppose there's 2 points to that question. It's hard to tell whether that had that impact or not. It'd be a very sweeping statement to say it really harmed or encouraged some women to make false allegations against men. But I will come on to that issue. It was obviously important because obviously it really raised the issue about those issues that were affecting women. So again, I'm not going to denigrate the point of Me Too and what it was trying to achieve. I think that there has been, though, over the last 5 years, and it isn't down to Me Too particularly, but there has been this real push to erase male victims from the narrative on domestic abuse, even to the point where in the UK, the government classes all victims of domestic abuse, sexual violence, forced marriage as being victims of violence against women and girls. That means, therefore, a man who is a victim of domestic abuse is called a victim of violence against women and girls. A boy who's sexually abused is called a victim of violence against a girl. A gay man fleeing a forced marriage is called, by the UK government, officially a victim of violence against a woman. Now, it's Orwellian. How can you say that a man who is a victim of honour-based abuse is a woman? And then in the same breath saying we're fully supportive of supporting and recognising men. Well, you can't, because you're misgendering them on an industrial scale, which is, a line that I've used many times. And so one of the issues is that the narrative around male victims of all of those crimes has actually been skewed by a number of issues, and that's helped to marginalise them even further. Just on the issue around false allegations, it's been interesting. Last 2 months, really, in the UK, there's been a number of cases where women who have made false allegations and accusations against men have gone to prison for it. Some men have ended up in prison for it for a couple of months on remand because, some of the things that the police have been told. So the judge has said, right, we need to put you in prison until the case. And then, they're in prison for 2 months for something that's an utter lie. And there was quite an infamous case in the northwest of England where a woman made false accusations against a number of men who basically were saying that they were either saying they were partners of mine, and others were in kind of like race as well, being accused that they were being kind of groomed or horrific crimes, and it's just untrue. And loads of these guys were named and stuff, and then it was she went to prison, and another lady in the northeast of England's recently gone to prison for similar offences. So the police are aware of false allegations. They're hard to prove, but women in the UK have gone to prison for quite significant sentences for that crime.
One guest I had on he came on and he told his story anonymously, and he had actually gone into the court system, and he was a military trained individual who the abuse escalated into physical abuse as well. And he brought it up. And while he was in the courtroom, the judge and the attorney both laughed at him and said, "You're a military trained man. You should have defended yourself." And of course, his response was, if I would have defended myself, then I would have been arrested for physically assaulting her. Do you think that view is different in the UK? I do feel like how you had mentioned that there are more advances in the UK in terms of domestic violence and abuse. So I'm not sure if that kind of mind frame or mindset is similar, or if it's a little bit more understanding over there.
I would say, I mean that's a terrible example, but I'm not surprised by it. There are still challenges for male victims, and I still talk to a lot of male victims and some of the organisations who work with them, where they've gone to the police and they've gone through the court system, not been taken seriously. But it's not as common as it was 5-10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, we used to get men calling us all the time saying, well, I took all this evidence, we rang you, we looked at your website, you say, when you go to the police, bring all this evidence. We did, took someone with me, got all these photographs, and still laughed at by the police. That isn't as bad now, primarily because of training, and also because they're seeing more male victims, the police coming through. There's more women who are police officers now in the UK, and that's really helped male victims as well, because those women get how violent women can be. I remember it vividly a couple of months ago when I was speaking, and there was a lady there, and she said, remember, we all grew up in playgrounds, and there was always 2 or 3 women who were really violent in our school playgrounds, who were in our class. Never forget that. And that's been helpful because, women understand women can be violent, for example. So that's really helped. But it is still what I would call, there still is a risk that it's a postcode lottery or a zip code lottery, if you like, in terms of some areas, but also in terms of the police officer you actually get, which will be the same for all sorts of crimes. But I'm not surprised by that attitude, and it's obviously complete disgraceful, sexist as well, completely sexist. And the chap from the armed forces or military. Yeah, I mean, or anyone. If any man touches a woman in self-defense because they're trying to restrain them or they're subject to the violence, the perpetrator will use that and get them carted off to the police. And the police will come round and see a 6'3" guy and a 5'6" woman and say, well, when you look at it visually, it's like, really? We're doing okay-ish in the UK. It needs to be better, but we're on the right path.
I had watched one of the advertisements, I think that was put out by Mankind Initiative, but it was a video of a man and a woman couple walking through a public area, and he's kind of being verbally abusive and grabs her arm and then eventually grabs her chin, and everybody jumps in to help her. And then they reverse the role where she's doing the same to him. And she also grabs his face, and everyone is looking and sort of laughing. And that video really kind of hit home because you think about it. And I think that society's perception is, well, what did he do to deserve that? Or, oh, he'll be sleeping on the couch tonight, or, kind of chuckling like, oh, at least she's standing up for herself. So I agree. There's definitely sort of a societal misperception when it comes to even seeing things in public. Do you think that those advertisements are helping to change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that video came about when I remember being approached, because it's 9 years old now this month, or in May. In May it will be 9 years old. So need to think about what we do on a 10th anniversary. But anyway, to test that. But the where that came about actually was for those certain generation. I'm not into that music. I'm into sort of 80s, 90s loud indie stuff, all the miserable stuff like Nirvana, for example, or the Pixies. But when it came about was that if you cast your mind back, there was a altercation in a lift between Solange Knowles and Jay-Z. Like cast your mind all the way back there. And so what happened was I was then called up by a digital brand agency who make all these videos for big corporates, saying they do a few free ones a year for charities, and they were really incensed because what was happening on Twitter and Facebook, I'm not even sure Instagram or certainly not TikTok was around then, I'm not sure, but certainly Twitter was like, there was a hashtag that said hashtag what did Jay-Z say? So basically the premise was it was Jay-Z's fault that Beyonce's daughter, sister, went crazy in the lift at him. And that really incensed quite a lot of people at the agency. And so they just rang me out of the blue. And I'd had this idea for ages, but, it costs a lot of money, and we haven't got hardly any money. So it's not something we could fund ourselves. So they just did it. So I said, well, this is the concept, reverse the genders, see what happens. And they just went off and did it. And then they brought it back. The video is called hashtag violence is violence. And you can Google it and search for it, and it will come up in all sorts of different languages. We all our videos and they're all free usage, so people can use them, and it's in a zillion different languages. And it's very sweary as well. I didn't write the script. I kind of that was a concept. And then when I got it, I said, can I change? There's too much swearing. This was too late. It's all done. I was like, okay, fine. But that did change the narrative. I'll go on to other kind of why popular culture is really important for in this area. But also just on that, I remember a story was that I was then going, but there were people criticising the video. There was some that said, well, that's a fine video, but remember, it's all about female victims. So, good ad, but, it's all about women rather than it's all about women and men. It's all about women and then full stop. And then the other thing, there was even blogs about it saying it was faked. I remember going on a radio station in the UK, and just before the radio station started, I got a call from a producer, and it was a big one as well, so big UK wide one, saying, we trailed that you were coming on to talk about the video, and we've had dozens of calls from people saying it's a fake, don't run it. And I'm like, literally, and it's just a lie. It isn't just the reputation of me personally and the charity, but also this big brand agency. This is like a multi-zillion pound brand agency. They're not going to fake give me and upload something that's a fake, because their brand will be just destroyed. Yeah, but there were people so motivated to extinguish and make sure the issue of male victims was not a thing and not discussed, that they were willing to ring up a national radio station, basically lie, and to try and get the whole interview about it taken off air. And I had to sort of say, no, it's like genuine. And then, the producers saying, yeah, but they're saying this is, well, they're liars. I mean, come on. But people were so motivated. That's sort of like, it shows you in some places what we're up against. The bigger issue, though, Ingrid, is about popular culture. And what we've seen in the UK off and on, including in sexual violence, which is a partner issue. There's a little bit of crossover, but sexual violence against men. I mean, popular culture, we've seen some soap operas. I don't know how that translates around the world. It's probably quite a British term, I think. But like a program that has like 30 episodes a season, that type of thing. But these programs, there's four of them in the UK, and they're on about 3 times a week, every week for about 40 years. I mean, Coronation Street, EastEnders, Emmerdale, Doctors, and a couple of others. I mean, Coronation Street's been on the telly 3 times. Well, initially it was 2 times, but it's been on 3 to 4 times a week since the mid 1960s. It's still going. So anyway, so these are quite really popular, and there's been features in episodes and storylines in there featuring male victims of domestic abuse or sexual violence, and in other programs like it. And that's really helped the kind of popular culture in terms of like thinking about domestic abuse and sexual violence affecting men. Also, I mean, huge. I mean, there was one on this Coronation Street about 10 years ago where a character called Tyrone was a mechanic and he had an abusive wife. And basically, the Coronation Street were then putting our helpline number on afterwards. And we had all of our team sort of ready thinking, and we had no idea. And literally, as soon as our number come up, the phones were going and the team were on the phone till like 4 a.m, of people ringing up and then continuing. So that's the power of popular culture. Lots of documentaries. I mean, if anyone, some of these are obviously then been put up YouTube, probably breaking maybe copyright, but if they're on, Vimeo or whatever, things like Abused by My Girlfriend by Alex Skill, which I think has been covered before. I mean, an hour long, if you ever watched that. Channel 5 in the UK had a documentary called When Women Abuse Men. And there's been a number of other documentaries, and I think that there's some more coming as well, featuring male victims, including on the Discovery Channel and others. So there have been things in popular culture featuring male victims, and the media do cover it a lot. So I'm regularly on in the newspapers, on national TV. So I was on the equivalent of a morning show on maybe NBC or Fox or ABC or whatever, about two weeks ago. So you're looking at 5 million people watching it, and I'm sitting there with a male survivor of domestic abuse talking about it. And so popular culture really does make a difference.
There was another advertisement you had about there's a man that was in a bar with his 2 buddies, and he's receiving all these text messages from his partner. And you could see in his face, he's trying to cover up what he's thinking. And then he's flashing to, what's going to happen when I go home or what has happened. And when he leaves, excuses himself from the bar, my thought was, okay, he's either going to go home and get abused or he's going to attempt to take his life. So that's another big thing that's tied with domestic abuse is suicide, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Suicide ideation. So, and obviously some men do go through it. And I mean, again, those government statistics, statistics office shows around one in 10 men who suffer from abuse from their partner have considered taking their own life. Also, there's other figures that show that's around 15%. Have considered taking it. Of course, it's difficult to know if somebody has taken their own life, whether that is due to domestic abuse, because obviously they're not there to talk about it. But certainly I've sat on a number of reviews of suicide cases where I've been asked to join the review because there's elements of domestic abuse involved. I think been on about 4 of those actually. So that's been a really really important part of that. It affects women as well. So the suicide ideation is an issue that affects women as well. I mean, some of that is mixed up around also child contact, where the relationship's broken up and the man does not, or is not allowed to, by, I would always say, an abusive mother, unless there is some element of risk and safeguarding, which is genuine, i.e. why a mother isn't allowing her ex to see their kids, because on there will be occasions where there is genuine risk and safeguarding, and that obviously has to be respected. But where there isn't the genuine issues, and not only the mother, and obviously it happens the other way around as well, but the mother will manipulate the children and the children's relationship with their father as a way of controlling him, either through psychology, breaking arrangements, for example, even when they've been agreed by the court, changing plans at last moment, or of course financial abuse, where they're basically making court orders, so the father has to then pay for more lawyers and solicitors and barristers and counsels and whatever to go back to the court to get another court order that then 6 months later is broken again. And that really does have an impact on fathers. My view is that kind of parental alienation, there's some dispute by some academics and others that parental alienation does not exist, but they're not talking on the basis of any evidence, and their view is very ideological and is incorrect, and I'm happy to be on the record on that. But parental alienation really is a big problem and adds to suicide risk to both mothers who are alienated as well as fathers. So it's an issue that probably affects more men than women, because probably more mothers have the primary responsibility for children, but it does happen always round. And again, I try not to get into this tit for tat, oh, this happens to more men than women, so we should ignore the women that it affects, because that kind of gender identity politics doesn't really help. And also it runs completely counter to mine and the charity's philosophy about taking a very inclusive approach to this.
I agree. And actually, there is a story I'm starting to look into to cover regarding parental alienation, where the child actually ended up taking his own life because of the situation. So I think that's also a concern. One thing in regards to societal views, and I think this goes for both men and women, but probably more specifically for men, is the victim blaming. And again, that kind of goes back to the fact of what did he do? Or, what is wrong with the victim, more or less, in the relationship that they would not get out before the abuse escalates.
Oh, absolutely, Ingrid. I mean that is an issue. Again, I come back to this size difference when, generally speaking, men are bigger than women, and therefore you do get that response. And we saw that in that, hashtag violence is violence video, effectively people saying, well, you must have done something to deserve it. And I've heard other people come out and say that sort of thing, that kind of using the perpetrator behaviour, using that, switching it. I think it's called DAVO, domestic abuse reverse victim. I can't remember the O now. Sorry, it's been a long week. That's been a particular issue. I think also, again, this societal reflection, what did you do to deserve it? That is a real issue. One of the other intriguing things I looked at, some statistics from, we have a domestic abuse commissioner in the UK, actually appointed by the government, whose remit is to look at domestic abuse policy and practice across the UK. And she did some research just before Christmas, asking, men and women about, what they want from support services. And the biggest answer for men was that when they want to get support, it's not actually for them, it's actually for their partner. So they're basically wanting to fix their partner, they're putting their partner before themselves. And that was far bigger than the female figure. Also, family courts was a big issue. But I found that intriguing. And it's an old-fashioned word that doesn't get used as much because it's maybe not politically correct to use, but the word, chivalry. And so basically these men who are being abused by their partner, female partner primarily, their primarily concern is trying to fix and help and support their partner above and beyond trying to help and support themselves. And I thought that was very, very intriguing. I mean, because there's often common issues about love, marriage, or being a partner for life. Often, obviously, issues about children, not knowing where to go, have got the money to leave, all of that type of thing, which are kind of general commonalities between men and women. But that one really stuck out. The most common reason men wanted support was not for them, but actually for their abusive partner. Fascinating it was. So, that is chivalry right there. Women and men putting women and children first. The old Titanic scenario. I mean,
Right.
But that's there. And that research was last year. So this isn't old research.
And that's very interesting. I never, for some reason, I didn't consider that as, one of the reasons. What do you think the average person, so people who either have worked in the arena of domestic abuse or have lived throughout or have known somebody that has lived through domestic abuse, are able to recognize things and they're able to sort of foresee what needs could be. But what about the average person that doesn't have any exposure to it and they're listening to this and they think, I want to help? What do you think people can do?
The key thing is that firstly, there's lots of information on websites around not only wherever you are in the world, but also look at things internationally. So, if you're looking, our website, mankind.org.uk, has lots of information about what the type of abuse men go through, but also what you can do to actually help, or if you are a victim, what you can do to help. And they're universal. So all of that information applies to any man anywhere in the world. The second thing is that even if you're on websites that have information which is really just talking about women, that all applies to men too. So don't be put off by information that just talks about, female victims. Just like in your mind, just switch it It all applies. So that's really, really important. The second area is that, if you think somebody could be a victim of domestic abuse, and the key signs are things like changing behaviour, changing pattern of contact. If you haven't seen your son for a year, he's got a new girlfriend, boyfriends, and it's like, well, is that normal? And also issues around kind of being anxious, being depressed, lack of personal hygiene, hiding excuses for, injuries, for example. They're all kind of red flags. They're kind of, if you've got any spidey sense, that should be starting to sort of like, your spidey sense should start to be triggered a bit. And then the key thing is to try and find a way to reach out, because, victims of domestic abuse will want some support, whether that's actual support in being able to get out of the relationship, like being safe, for example, but also they will want emotional support and the reassurance that there are people on their side. And now often they will want people, and we recommend it if they can. It's good that if someone wants to go to the police to report that they're a victim of domestic abuse, or talk to a work manager, for example, that they actually have somebody that they trust with them. So what you need to do is kind of like just move the door ajar bit by bit. And often with men, they may not disclose immediately, but they know that somebody's looking out for them, and that somebody's interested and thinks there's something going on. So if you kind of, try and reach out to them, the more you do it, but not be in their face, they have to think about how they can leave. You just move that door ajar a bit by bit. And I think at some stage they'll walk through it. And I think that they're the key things, but there's lots of information. Also ring helplines up. If there's, there are helplines available for victims of domestic abuse, and they will listen to friends and family members. And of course, you've got to think about danger and risk. We've had occasions where people have said, well, I know so-and-so was violent against somebody and I saw it. And it's like, well, why didn't you ring the police? They didn't want me to. And it's like, yeah, but somebody's been like physically damaged. So I think that there are, they're the kind of key things. The other thing with a lot of men, two other things. I mean, a lot of men will seek help and come back to this anonymity issue without wanting other people knowing either they're in trouble or they're actually trying to get help. That's why websites are so important, because they are they are completely, within reason, anonymous. And lots of men go on our website and other websites, get information, and then get out of difficult relationships without telling anybody that that they've ever been in a relationship. And I've seen it where I had a stand at a conference and I caught someone's eye and I'd walked around some of the tables. It was a men's conference, so there's prostate cancer stands and, anti-smoking stands and all sorts of things. And this chap walked round and I caught his eye and I thought, he wants to come on my stand, but he doesn't want to get anything, because if he takes something from my stand, he's effectively disclosing. So I was next to a prostate cancer charity website stand, so I started chatting to them, and then I saw out of the corner of my eye him just walk past, and he had one of our leaflets. So he would not come to the stand whilst somebody was standing behind it. So rather than all of this baloney about, if men need to talk, they should change and all of this sort of stuff, which I think is the wrong lens. Primary responsibility to help men is on society and public services, not on men. And therefore, it's important to make everything as male friendly as possible, and anonymity and information is really important in that.
I couldn't agree more, because I think when you have somebody in a domestic abuse situation, they're already being isolated, either directly being, physically taken away to locations where they're physically isolated from friends, family, or cutting off contact. And as a friend or family or colleague, if you also begin to, well, they know better, I'm not going to bother talking to them anymore. If when they want help, they can come to me. You're closing that opportunity for them to, like, they're already feeling alone. So now their support system is leaving them alone as well. So I think that is a good point, to just continue to support them and keep that door open. And eventually, hopefully, they can feel comfortable enough to walk through.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely key. And, validate them, believe them, take them seriously. I've got something called a 5-second test. If a man discloses to you about a problem, including domestic abuse, if you kind of visually and verbally kind of like, I don't believe you, then the man will just shut down, may not talk to anyone else. I mean, that may be the case for the women, but as I said, I'm not an expert in female psychology, but I'm not necessarily saying I'm an expert in male psychology either, but generally that would be the issue. I think the other thing is to think about as well on communications and others, is that the second most popular web page on our website after types of domestic abuse is our survivors' stories. And basically they're a list of case studies, genuine case studies that guys have sent us, that talk about how they met their partner, what happened, and how they escaped. And that's the second most popular page, and it's obviously on the home page because it's called Survivor Stories. And it's got quite a few of them, all different ages. It's got some links to newspaper articles where guys have been able to leave abusive relationships. And again, what that says is that many men think they're the only guy in the world this has ever happened to, and that there isn't any hope, and they won't be able to get out of the escape and get out of the situation. So the key thing is that those case studies validate that domestic abuse against men is a thing. It talks about different experiences, many of which will have elements of what those men are going through, but also it gives them that, right, that's how that guy got out, or that guy got out, so can I. And, men have a real sense of belonging, camaraderie, and, a sense of, a sense of wanting to take action. And if they see how other people have done it, that really helps them, because hope is so important. You've got to have hope, and every single case study and all the media work that we do primarily is all about, if you're a man listening to this or watching this or viewing this, there's lots of guys like you going through this right now, but there's also lots of guys escaping or making plans to escape. So you can too. And so you've got to give guys hope.
I agree. And I know you're getting pressed for time. So is there any last tips or comments that you want to make for either men who are in abusive situations or anyone else?
Yeah. So, I suppose a couple of tips, really. I mean, a couple of things to think about, I'll leave everybody with. And as I said, look at our website and all of that type of thing, and copy everything shamelessly. So, one of the things I'll come back to is about we're trying to spread the message. So, if you want to use our videos, if you want to use, any of the materials, or of course, if you've got materials that are even better than ours, we'll have them as well. Thank you. But please use the material on our website. It's there to be used. We're a charity, and part of our, being a charity is to try and spread the message. The key thing for men, I always say, you're not alone, you're not weak, and you're not to blame. Men like you are going through this every single day, but men like you are also leaving or making plans to. And my comment and plea for the public, friends, family, work colleagues, and people in public services is, make sure you think that domestic abuse and recognise that domestic abuse happens to men in exactly the same way that it happens to women. So make sure your spidey sense is attuned for men as well as for women too.
Perfect. That's great advice. And do you want to leave the contact information for Mankind Initiative?
Yeah, the best place to contact us, go for our website, mankind.org.uk, and we're on Facebook and Twitter as well. I'm too old to worry about TikTok, so we're sticking with Facebook and Twitter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for joining me again. It's been a pleasure. Amazing information you shared with all of us.
Absolute pleasure, Ingrid, and what a great podcast series this is.
Thank you so much.
That was such a well put together and informative discussion, don't you think? There are so many resources on the Mankind Initiative website, including how to get help, how to get involved, and access to read survivors' stories. I will share that link in my show notes. As always, I will have another story for you next week. Until then, have each other's back, and always remember, there is hope, and you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, 3, podcast.com. Follow 1in3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1in3podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1in3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.